perspective and contribute to the lively and respectful conversation we are sharing today. And now I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Sanchita Balachandran. Sanchita is an art conservator and museum professional with 2 decades of experience preserving objects and sites of cultural heritage. She is currently Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, where she researches archaeological materials and teaches courses on the study and care of museum collections. Sanchita is founder and director of Untold Stories, a nonprofit organization that seeks to represent and preserve a fuller spectrum of cultural heritage. Sanchita, thank you for being with us today. Our next speaker will be Dominique Luster, MLIS. She is Charles Teenie Harris Archivist at the Carnegie Museum of Art. She is an Emmy Award-winning archivist and information and cultural heritage professional. She is a TEDx speaker and an expert on Black identity in art, as well as silenced histories and records. She is above all a champion for Black art. Thank you, Dominique, for being here. So, Sanchita, I will now invite you to give us your short presentation, after which I will invite Dominique to give hers. And I'm going to share my screen so that people can see your slides and we can get started.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. There seems to be some chatter about how the chat can only be seen by the panelists. So María, Carmen, or Sylvia, if you have a chance to amend that, that would be amazing. And well, while we're looking at this, you can see that the full remarks of this talk are actually at this URL for those who might find it helpful. Okay, so because I'm very old school, I'm going to read. So, hello everyone, I'm Sanchita Balachandran. As I mentioned, the full remarks are here at this URL and will hopefully be put in the chat shortly for those who might find it helpful. For those who may not be able to see me, I'm a brown-skinned woman with shoulder-length curly hair, and I'm wearing fuchsia glasses and a black sweater. I'm speaking from a place now called Baltimore, but that is the ancestral homeland of the Susquehannock people. It is also a place of gathering. Oop, I think we're skipping. We need to go back to the previous one. Uh-oh.
I apologize. There seems to be an error.
No worries.
There we go.
Perfect. Is there some way we could just put the URL in the chat? María, Carmen, do you mind? There it is. Can people see the URL and get to it? Yes, okay, great. All right, so I'm Sanchita again, and I'm speaking from a place now called Baltimore, but that is the ancestral homeland of the Susquehannock people. It's also a place of gathering and stewardship for the Accohannock, the Piscataway, the Nanticoke, the Lumbee, and the Cherokee peoples. And I'm so grateful, most especially given the circumstances of the last 11 months, to have had the safety and comfort of being in this place. I want to thank Silvia Rohr Samaniego of the University Art Gallery at the University of Pittsburgh for the kind invitation to speak in celebration of the launch of the Museum Studies major at UPitt. And I'm grateful to be in conversation with Dominique Luster and María Carmen Barrios Giordano. We have the next slide, please. Most of my time, at least until March 2020, when the pandemic closed our university museum, was spent among archaeological items from Greece, Rome, and Egypt, studying and conserving them for evidence of the people who made, used, and were buried with these objects thousands of years ago. I have the privilege of feeling how such things rest in my hand as they once did in someone else's in the distant past. I see up close the exquisite craftsmanship as well as the all too human screw-ups or evidence of use that made these surfaces the way they are today. To be a temporary steward of archaeological items is also to be aware that many of these items are funerary, placed in their loved ones' graves to ensure a safe passage to the next life. It is intimate and emotional work. And as a carer for items that are thousands of years old, separated from descendant communities by millennia and geographic distance, I've worried for some time about this question. What do I owe the families and loved ones of the ancient dead? Next slide, please. In thinking about turning points for this conversation, I realized that this date, February 25th, marks the 1-year anniversary of what was a major turning point in both my professional and personal life, one that I'm still coming to terms with, because it was exactly 1 year ago today that I first met my maternal grandfather, V. Madhavan Pillai. And I met him not in Nagarkoil, southern India, which was his home, but rather I met him here in the Asian and African Studies reading room at the British Library in London. My grandfather died in 1957. The stories that have been passed down to me about him have a certain mythic quality, the way that an ancient hero is both larger than life and yet somehow insubstantial, with nothing tangible to hold on to. But there are two details that have stuck with me. One, that he traveled from the then South Indian state of Travancore to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to England, and then to Scotland in the early 1930s to train at the Edinburgh Forestry College. He studied silviculture, the art and science of managing forests. This degree prepared him to return to India as a well-trained subject of the British Empire, managing the extraction of South Indian timber and other natural products for imperial use. Next slide, please. There's a single image of him in the field, perhaps in Dunkeld, in the big tree country of Scotland, north of Edinburgh in 1934. Sitting among a group of shirtless, ruddy, presumably British men is my grandfather. My eye is drawn to his inky skin, the lock of hair falling onto his forehead, the gleam of the curved sickle pressing against his jutting collarbone. What was he thinking in this picture? There's one other fact I know about him. By the time he died, he had the same title as I currently do, conservator. While I'm a conservator of archaeological objects, a carer of items belonging to the ancient dead, he was a conservator of forests, a caretaker of living, growing beings. While my grandfather spent his days in tropical forests among elephants, monkeys, and most of all trees, much of my daily work as a museum professional, especially in this pandemic time, is spent record making and record keeping in the dense thickets of our digital database and internet servers. And this is, of course, the work that many of us cultural heritage professionals do, that daily, mundane, unseen, often thankless work, checking paperwork, updating catalog records, writing reports, tracking items from one place to another. May I see the next slide, please? And it was because of such work that I found this catalog record, the passport for a person who had the same name as my grandfather. And it was why I was in the British Library in February 2020. The news was already filled with talk of a strange virus, but within the quiet of the reading room, it was as though time stood still. Submitting my researcher slip and waiting for the mere 40 minutes it took to receive a requested item, I felt nervous excitement, dread, and regret. Dread, because what if this was not my grandfather's passport? Regret, because I'd been a researcher in this very same room at least twice before, for days at a time, not knowing that this document, something that was once perhaps in my grandfather's pocket as he made the perilous journey from India to England, was within reach. There's a longer story to how I gained access to this document, but for now, I would like to acknowledge the kindness of librarian John Chignoli, who put it in my hands on February 25th, 2020. I recently learned that this date, the anniversary of when I met my grandfather, is also John's birthday. So John, if you're watching, happy birthday and thank you. I don't believe in fate or coincidences, but there is something rather wondrous about this conjunction of events. Next slide, please. The passport arrived in this envelope that says, please use this envelope to issue passports to reader. I had become a reader, not a relative. It's hard to describe the feeling of holding this item, unsure if it was really my grandfather's. The anonymous cardboard cover gave nothing away, but the British Library's catalog information. I forced myself not to rush to the photograph page in case it wasn't him. Next slide, please. On the front page, embossed with Empire of India, is my grandfather's name and his status, British protected person, native of the Indian state of Travancore. And the subsequent pages held intimate details of his life, his body, his birth date, which no one in my family remembered. And then the photograph, the relief of knowing his face from the features I recognize in my aunts, uncles, cousins, my mother. But here he was at the tender age of 20, alone himself, his own self. What does it mean to meet your own kin for the first time in the reading room of a colonial archive? Sitting there, I was overcome with two feelings that seem irreconcilable. First, a sense of anger and also deep grief for the loss of my own family member whose life was intimately marked by the violence of colonialism, and for the ongoing sense of loss to my own family 2 generations later. But also an intense gratitude for all the people who cared for this object, documented it, cataloged it, stored it, digitized it, and brought it to me nearly a century later. These people are my professional kin. How can I make sense of this embeddedness of harm and recovery, disconnection and reunion? Next slide, please. I must confess that a part of me wondered what it would feel like to simply walk out of the reading room with my grandfather's passport, because surely it belonged more to me than an archive where anyone might request it, touch it, read these intimate details. And my family members asked me the same question: why do they have it when we should? Our professional literature is finally beginning to urge us to decolonize our institutions and our practices, and I find myself genuinely at a loss as to what this would mean for me, because I'm both the descendant of British colonial subjects and an immigrant and settler colonist on native land. For over 2 decades, I've trained and worked in a museological discipline and in museum institutions built on colonial, imperial, and white supremacist ideologies. And every decision I make preserves the vestiges of these histories and legacies. So what can I decolonize without losing some part of myself and my family's story? What does repatriation, return, and reunion mean for me? And what does it mean for the work I do? Next slide, please. It's been hard to know what the work or even purpose of a conservator and museum professional is when the museum collection itself is out of daily reach. I miss being with people's things. I worry about them because I owe the families and loved ones of the ancient dead. I'm a conservator. I believe in the value of repair, and when repair isn't possible, I believe in the potential of care, to care long enough that the person who needs to find these items will someday find them, just as a long line of anonymous carers did for me. For the past 11 months, as I've worked remotely from the museum, I've taken daily walks along the path in the small urban forest, mere footsteps from where I live. The trees I walk among are nothing like the forests of South India, and yet I've been wondering about my ever-growing attachment to the trees I meet regularly, whose small changes I note day after day. I've been thinking about the funerary items I care for, the ones that ease the passage of loved ones from one life to the next, just as a passport eased the movement of my grandfather from one world to another. What if it's these items that witness our transitions, marking our time, easing our passage from one way of being into the world into another, more caring one? Thank you.
Sanchita, thank you so much for that presentation. You've given us so much to think about, and you've been so generous to share this story. Now I would like to invite Dominique, if you could please unmute, and I will put up your slides.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Sanchita again for such a just beautiful narrative that she, again, was so generous to share with us. It's such a moving and riveting story. And I really appreciate the opportunity and the space to be here and to share that space with her, to share that space with all of you, and especially with you, Sylvia and María Carmen. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here and to have this great conversation that we're going to have following the presentation. So thank you again. I'm here today as a representative of the Teenie Harris Archive and of the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've been working with the Charles Teenie Harris Archive since about 2016, and it's been one of the greatest privileges in my life. And I will say Teenie Harris has assuredly become my absolute favorite photographer, though I may be biased, but I think it's quite a phenomenal collection. Teenie Harris, Charles was his first name, was a Black photojournalist here in Pittsburgh who worked for the Pittsburgh Courier from about 1935 to he retired in 1975. And more than just a photojournalist, as if there is anything just about it, it's an incredible space in the photography land, and he was able to document and assume this mass collection that chronicles Black life in those everyday nuances and natures of Black life. For many years, he became an exceptionally trusted and embraced member of the Black community here in Pittsburgh. And now at this time, The collection is predominantly of his negatives. There are approximately 80,000 large format negatives in the collection, but there's also a substantial amount of color, mostly 35 millimeter. There are a smaller number of prints, but they are absolutely beautiful. There's a small collection of manuscript materials, as well as what I like to say is kind of like our golden space. 150 hours of oral histories, and these aren't oral histories that Teenie Harris took, but they're actually oral histories that the museums and archive staff took of people in the photographs as we were collecting and trying to gather data, as we were trying to identify people, because believe it or not, for a collection of this size, it came to the museum completely unidentified, uncatalogued. There wasn't a single person, a single label. There was nothing on any of these 80,000 negatives. And so our great work, our great privilege over the past several years has been to identify and to reconnect names and stories to these images, and making sure that we are helping to remember and uplift and support a community in the way that they wish to be remembered. And that means by taking in their oral histories to do that as the sole way that we do documentation of researching and finding names. For example, of this little girl, we would try to find who she is and do an oral history of her. So I'd love to show you some of my favorite photographs from the collection. And I think, María Carmen, if you would go to the next slide, I think it will give us kind of a baseline of what is in this collection and what my work kind of circles around, and the amazing people that I get to come into community with through this collection. So who did Teenie Harris photograph? Let's jump in. So one of the largest, I would say, subsets or maybe categories in the collection is the studio portraits. Teenie maintained a studio in the Hill District on Center Ave from about 1935 to maybe like 1948, 49, not terribly long. But for a place that he did not maintain very long, he had an absolute just surplus of portraiture work, and it's absolutely beautiful. And one of the, I guess, subsections of the portraiture work that is one of my personal favorites are the military portraits. We have about I believe the last number I counted was about 1,500 unidentified soldiers' portraits just from World War II. So that's thousands of men and women, of Black men and women from the Pittsburgh area who fought for a country that at that time did not show the same rights and privileges to the soldiers who were serving that country serving their country in return. So there are also graduation portraits. There are family portraits. Yes, please, let's go to the next slide. There are portraits of every walk of life, but there are also these very intimate personal family narratives. This is a photograph of a birthday party, of a baby birthday party. Those are extremely common. There are photographs of children. There are photographs of weddings. This is another one of the largest unidentified sections within the collection. We believe that there are a couple thousand unidentified weddings, and it's truly remarkable thinking about Sanchita's story of how can we help to reconnect families and narratives by reattaching people, family, and husbands and wives, making sure that their names are accurately told and shared through these archival collections. And to whom do the collections truly belong to? As an archivist, I believe my role is as a steward, not necessarily as like a gatekeeper. And so my job is to this community and to help add and re-add the names of these weddings back to the photographs. There's also, María Carmen, if you would please go to the next slide, a substantial number of photographs, I believe, of sports. We maybe have a couple thousand photographs of just these really beautiful portraits of sports figures throughout the 1940s, 50s, and about the early 60s, but the majority of the sports photographs are from the 40s and 50s. There's also a great deal of musicians, which I believe is the next slide, or entertainers, whichever one. This is an absolutely gorgeous photograph of Lena Horne as a younger Lena Horne here in Pittsburgh. And this photograph just goes to the trust that Teenie had, as you saw in the previous photograph. You see the just access and closeness and connection and community engagement that Teenie had as the kind of go-to guy in the Hill District for as the neighborhood was telling its story. Teenie was there to document it. And so you have photographs like this one. I believe the next one is going to be the musicians that I mentioned earlier. This is a photograph from the Hurricane Club here in Pittsburgh. And it's pretty incredible to see these photographs because we don't expect any of these individuals to still be with us today. However, the legacy of these individuals is still very much with us today. Their children are very much with us today and can speak to the fact that at the base in the back there is Leroy Brown. Leroy Brown, before this band became the Leroy Brown Band. In the front, that's Honey Boy Minor, and in the back in the corner there is a very, very, very young Errol Garner. And if you're familiar with the history of jazz at all, you'll know how important he is to the story of jazz. There's also, I believe the next photograph is going to be the parades. There's so much that could be said about the parades and just the lavishness and lushness of the parades that went through the Hill District. This is a military parade specifically, but there would be all kinds of parades and everyone just kind of stepped out in their best, and it was quite a celebration throughout the Hill. Next slide, please. Again, just when we talk about the closeness and the access and community and public trust that Teenie Harris had, there's no better photo that I think helps to demonstrate that, such as a photograph of Kennedy here in the Pittsburgh area. This particular photograph was taken in Monessen. However, but it speaks, when you're working with a speed graphic camera, it speaks to just, there's no such thing as Zoom. Teenie Harris, as a Black photojournalist for the Pittsburgh Courier, is on this platform as a respected member of his community. Next slide, please. The social clubs, I personally, it's not necessarily archival, but what I love about the social clubs is just that you can see the ladies and their gowns and their hair, and just the just glam of this era is something that I always just love to behold. This was a secret event, so I have no idea why or how Teenie was there, but he was and was able to capture this photograph. But in addition to the social clubs, there's also the nightlife. There's a number of entertainment and nightclubs. María, Carmen, next slide, please. The nightlife in Pittsburgh is something truly to be beheld. It's quite impressive, if nothing less. There's a saying that I've heard through the oral histories where if you weren't in New York and you weren't in Chicago, you wanted to be in Pittsburgh at the Crawford Grill, at the Hurricane Club, at the Lewandai Club, at the, you wanted to be here because this is where the action was. Next slide, please. And so for anything in anyone's life, particularly in Black life in America, it's not, Teenie Harris didn't just capture all of the celebration, but he also captured struggle and triumph. So there are photographs in this collection that depict the civil rights era, discrimination, housing discrimination, education discrimination, healthcare discrimination. And I believe the next slide will actually be a photo of Dr. King. And it's interesting because we don't have terribly many photographs of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the collection, but what's really special is all of the men in the photograph around him supported him, were the kind of local branch of the Pittsburgh chapter of the civil rights movement, and were often bishops and leaders and educators and writers and thinkers and activists and advocates. I mean, the work that was being done in Pittsburgh allowed and supported this greater national network of civil rights. And it's a story that is told in the Teenie Harris collection. And I believe this is my last slide here, but I just wanted to again thank everyone for even inviting me into this room, and to just kind of, as a grounding, just share the last little bit about who I am and what I do. Is that, you know, with the Teenie Harris Archive, my first and foremost job as the archivist is the physical preservation of the negatives and digital preservation for access. but mostly I find my work is to kind of help to steward that storytelling piece by adding and re-contributing names, dates, locations back to those photographs for the endpoint of community engagement. It's all about storytelling and collaboration with our community groups. And sometimes we even get to exhibit materials, and it's really, really exciting. So that I'm so excited for us to get started. So I would love to go ahead and close this slide so that we could all see each other. And María Carmen, I would love to throw it back to you now so that we can all chat.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you both for giving us such amazing presentations to start us thinking about inclusive practices in cultural heritage, both in archives and in collections. So both of you mentioned either stewardship or care of collections. And I want to ask you about how your thoughts about being temporary stewards of collections have changed throughout your career. I'm curious about whether your sense of obligation towards the past and perhaps towards the future has changed since you were in training. So Sanchita, I would love to have you go first.
Oh, gave me an easy question, huh? I think I came out of my training, of course, this is, decades ago now, thinking that I kind of had all the tools, I was ready to go. And I think I came out with this almost sort of a savior mentality that I was going to save it all. And that hit a very immediate wall of reality. And I think what I'm realizing more and more is that, my role as a very temporary steward, a temporary caretaker, means that at every stage I need to really carefully evaluate whether what I'm doing is defensible. And that means that constant evaluation means that something I did yesterday might not sit right with me today. And I think it's very hard for most of us who would really love, a guidebook, a set of guidelines, a code of ethics that makes sense in every situation. And I'm still in search of that. And the only thing I can think of is, the practices must change. That is the only way of being sure that we're actually in relationship with the collections we steward, in the real sense of a relationship, which requires constant kind of upkeep, response, negotiation, care. And that's really hard for, I think, most of us to recognize. It's hard work, but to me, that's the only thing I can think of. I don't know, Dominique, what do you think?
I think I actually agree with you. And I think coming out of my MLS, we are taught, I think we're taught a more permanent sense of care. We're taught that, and this is it is a very traditional mindset of being taught archives, and we gatekeep a little bit. And I hate to use that word, but we gatekeep and we provide access. But with the Teenie Harris collection, I've learned that I need the community and their support and their buy-in way more than they need me. And it's kind of changed my viewing of stewardship in better understanding that it is completely temporal. And I agree 100%. Something that I may have done in a preservation mindset 5 years ago, I wouldn't do 5 months ago. Maybe I wouldn't do now. And also I would say for my collection, being willing to hear the community when they disagree with the decision that you've made. So if we are seeking to preserve something a specific way or to provide access in a specific way, and we have maybe been out of slight alignment with the community, hearing that, taking it in and being open to saying, great, awesome, let's figure it out. Let's do this and do it right every single time.
Well, can I just follow up on that? I mean, I think for me, I feel like I'm beholden or responsible to two different kinds of communities. There's the sort of ancient community, which is often very abstract, right? And then there is the community at the institution where I work. So the students at Johns Hopkins, for example, and all of these people who come and work with the collection. And that was a huge shift for me, you know, coming out of a much more traditional museum environment where the best thing you could do to preserve something is put it away and have it, you know, on a glass shelf where no one could see it, sort of out of that state of perfect stability, to one of the best way to preserve something is to have it be in use.
Mm-hmm.
And that took a real shift for me. I don't know, how do you feel about that?
You know what actually taught me that theory more than anything else? I went to this fantastic workshop, and it was sponsored, I believe, by the University of Washington. I can't remember, but at any rate, they were working on a Merkatu project, and this Merkatu project seeks to invite in community elders from native sovereign lands and tribes in that area. And what they do is that it's through the use of those materials and through those narratives, songs, fabrics, textiles, what have you, it was the use of those materials that taught how it should have been preserved, or that preserves it in the first place through the passing of storytelling. So through the elders using certain materials in conjunction with younger members of the nation being present with the university, so that everyone was receiving this information. And it was also knowledge for the university on how to respect and how to keep those materials, and how they should be described, how they should be preserved, who should have access, who shouldn't. But it was also knowledge transfer for the younger generation through that kind of auditory storytelling. And so it passed down just by simply using it. It was absolutely incredible. And I don't remember exactly where I saw this, but I do believe it was a part of the Merkatu project. But it was absolutely incredible. The understanding of using something will actually help you preserve it better. And I would say the same thing in my experience has been applied with the Teenie Harris materials, in that the more that the images are actually out there, the more that they're circulating, the more that they are being shared, the more likely it is that we will actually identify the little girl in the photograph.
Dominique, Sanchita, what I'm hearing is a sense of questioning of protocols that sort of dictate the relationship between the public or people and archives or collections. So I'm interested in the notion of, to go back to reflect on something that you said in your presentation, Sanchita. You mentioned that there's this sort of protocol by which you were given the passport. And in that protocol of your interaction with the collection, you turned from having been a family member into a reader. That protocol changed you. It changed the nature of your interaction within the confines of, the system that regiments that. And so this system, to my understanding, is dictated by, protocols and procedures. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, what are protocols and procedures? What is the place of protocols and procedures for archives and collections management? And then how are they used and applied for objects? And how do you reflect on whether they remain ethical or remain good practices, good protocols to mediate these interactions between people and archives?
Oof. Well, people will tell you if they're not appropriate, which is often a little bit bracing, but incredibly important. And, here I really want to emphasize, I'm speaking from my own perspective, right? I think my own experience, and this is what I was really trying to make clear. My kind of, positionality as someone who is both an immigrant and, the descendant of colonized subjects, as well as a settler colonist, has everything to do with what I think is an appropriate set of protocols for my stuff. And I think Indigenous and Native peoples have their own protocols. I think every community that claims a certain type of material, should be responsible for that protocol setting. And that is, one of the real violent acts of colonialism and imperialism, right? The removal of the right to say, this is how our material should be taken care of at home with us. And so, you know, especially with the material that I, again, temporarily care for, I mean, I've tried to set some basic protocols in place that at least foreground that sense that this is not a given that you should have access. And I think this is another thing where, you know, access has turned into a kind of free-for-all, like everyone should have access. And that often comes at the harm of many other communities that have never been given access to their own things. So a lot of what I really try to emphasize, certainly when we're using materials in class, well, first I select materials that I think, I certainly never show, you know, human remains. I don't pass anything around that I believe is really, you know, I mean, is very hurtful. But I always remind my students before we start working with any collections, I mean, I don't know how many of these things came from funerary contexts. So you need to come in with that kind of respect, right? The incredible kind of, just the somberness, but also the kind of care that is essential. And I think just putting it, that slight kind of introduction to how one should come to things, changes things. But I also know that for, you know, certainly many of the Native representatives that I've talked to about how to properly care for materials, how they would prefer certain protocols to be in other collections. I mean, they have their own sets of appropriate procedures, ways of cultural protection to make sure that, you know, people doing the caring work aren't harmed or don't harm others. That's not my worldview because I'm not of those communities, but to me, it's incredibly important that we keep those in mind.
I don't know if I could say anything that could possibly just except for echo that comment. Sanchita, I think that's absolutely the right answer. I don't know what else I could even possibly add.
I have a question for you, Dominique, actually. I mean, one of the protocols that you mentioned to us was the, you know, identifying people in photographs. And I know from previous conversations we've had that sometimes there are competing claims about people in your photographs that perhaps come from the same community. And so what, you know, what kinds of questions arise for you when you are in that situation?
Well, I think the greatest part that I have learned is to listen twice as much as I talk, and to understand that everyone's perspective in reality is real and is correct. Everyone's story is correct. And there is, for the exhibition that we have up now in Sharp Focus, we drew great inspiration from a Henry Louis Gates quote for the kind of grounding of that exhibition. And Dr. Gates says, and this was a while ago, so the number's a little off, but he says, if there are 40 million African Americans in this country, then there are 40 million ways to be Black. And I have kind of, we've took that quote, and one, it's just very inspiring, but two, with Teenie Harris's collection, because there's 80,000 photos and hundreds of thousands of people in those photographs, every single one of those ways is correct. Every single one of those ways is the story of Blackness and their story. It's their story. Even if this particular photograph is remembered in one way by this person and one way by that person, everyone's story is still their story. Everyone's space and place is welcome here. And so I just kind of take everything and really I just listen twice as much as I talk. And of course, we fact check and we reconcile where we can. And I personally, as an archivist, I'm not afraid of duality of narrativity. Like our whole world is full of duality. There's plurals everywhere if you look for them and if you're open enough to receive them. And so, yes, we can sometimes get competing stories of who is who and when was when. Honestly, that's fine. I mean, maybe that's not the right archival answer, but it's fine.
I think that's actually a great question. And I wanted, this is a perfect way to turn to one of our audience questions. Again, you know, if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many as possible. So this is from Laura Minna. She says, many thanks to Sanchita and Dominique for your presentations. You both spoke about the importance of intangible qualities that make tangible objects special. Can you share any additional suggestions for how we can be better caretakers of these intangible qualities as we work as custodians for physical objects?
I have a quick story that I'd love to share about that one. So the Teenie Harris collection has been almost entirely digitized. So we actually don't work with the physical negatives very often, if at all. We've been very, very fortunate and blessed to have had those be digitized so that they could be shared, but it also means that we can print them for class use. So, or for whatever, we can print them, which is really great. However, one time we had an exhibition, and of course now we're working with digital surrogates on a wall, and we had a class of high school students that came in, and they were absolutely awesome. I don't know how our education department has so many connections with so many amazing teachers, but we had this class that came in and they were absolutely awesome. And I remember coming out of the offices and a group of maybe 3 or 4 10th grade gentlemen were sitting on the floor. And I know every curator on this chat right now is kind of like, what? But these 3 or 4 10th grade these gentlemen were sitting on the floor in the gallery with their backs against the wall, and they were flipping through photos. They were talking about the photo, and they wanted to sit across from it so they could see it, and they were talking, and they were genuinely deeply talking and debating about this photograph. And for me as an archivist, I've never wanted anything else in my life. It's absolutely just the most beautiful moment when I could not be there because I came out of the office to check on the school group, and they were just sitting there minding their own business, and I told the guards to leave them be, and they were just interacting in these completely intangible ways. I don't know if I could have lectured that moment for them about the materials, and I don't know how else to describe that. It was just something very special.
That's a fantastic, that I love that story. I love the fact that, sitting on the ground of a museum is a, valid way to interact with objects.
I think so too.
So Sanchita, actually the notion of digitization that Dominique brings up feeds into one of the questions for you specifically from Steph Gudera. They're asking, what are your thoughts on digitization in museum collections, and is the digital access to images of cultural pieces appropriate, especially when this isn't paired with efforts for repatriation? And this question comes in the context of you speaking about access not being a given.
Well, yeah, well, I can recommend a fantastic article that I've just been thinking with called The Crying Child by Temi Odumosu, which really talks about this problem of digitizing, colonial collections and then having this be out for anyone to have access to when some of these images are, very upsetting. And what are then the responsibilities of the digitizing agency in terms of making this material available? And I think this is probably something that's very true, especially for archival materials. But I think one thing I would love to talk about, actually following up on what Dominique was saying, I mean, to me, the real joy of working with a collection is when something happens that has nothing to do with you. It's just you set up the conditions in such a way that it sparks a conversation or a feeling. And I feel like that is my role with these collections. I've been teaching now for 10 years at Hopkins, and I wait for the beginning of every semester when students have that first opportunity to hold a real object from thousands of years ago in their hands. And there's just this moment of terror, because most people are afraid they're going to break something. And to anyone listening, we've had 10,000 students work with objects, and we have had 2 things damaged, and that wasn't the student's fault, that was our fault. So this idea that things cannot be used safely, I think for me is completely a non-starter. But when they have that kind of first interaction, there's just this moment, this like moment of connection between someone 2,000 years ago and this person in the moment. And it's like such a beautiful, you know, just that moment of connection. You can't lecture that. And I think one thing about like actually having physical things, as much as the sort of digital object is incredibly important in lots of different ways, the physical thing sparks all kinds of other conversations. There's the weight of it, the way it smells, the sheen of it. I mean, all of these other qualities that become so incredibly precious that you can't get from a digital thing. So to me, that is the real value of caretaking things so that they can actually be encountered in person, at least for now. But I think we do have to imagine what the future holds for these types of collections, right? How long is this going to be viable, given climate change, given all of the incredible inequities that we're seeing in our world, where only a certain few get access to collections and most people never get a chance to interact with them.
Sanchita, on that note of access and interaction with real objects, there are a couple of questions about repatriation, you know, about the importance of that very object and where that object is. And actually the question comes, you know, not just for Sanchita, but also for Dominique. So I'd like to give you the space to speak about your experience with repatriation efforts, both internationally and nationally.
I'm happy to go first because, you know, I don't know if I have as much experience or as much fodder to add on repatriation, specifically directed to the Teenie Harris collection. So I'm actually happy to gain some more wisdom from Sanchita. It's one of the beautiful things of having us paired together.
I mean, I think this is incredibly complicated. And it's, of course, I think, they're sort of legal questions, and then there are ethical questions, and then there are all kinds of, there's a physical repatriation and what some people describe as digital repatriation, or, you know, this week my class read Stephen Gilchrist's amazing essay for the Everywhen catalog, and he talks about Indigenous Australian ways in which there's spiritual repatriation of images and items. So I think this can take a lot of different forms. I think for me, the hardest thing is, you know, repatriation is this like solid word. And there are all of these different opportunities to engage and to do things that are right or feel right. And often there's not the space to have that conversation. So my sincere hope is that we can actually just sit down and say, well, you know, what do people need? What does a real sense of repatriation or return or reunion feel like? Because in some ways, I mean, even just thinking about the example that I shared, right? The fact that this duplicate passport, and it's a duplicate, so there was an original, which we don't have, right? We have very little in terms of material culture from my grandfather in my family. But the fact that there was this duplicate passport that survived in the colonial archive is why I can access it. So what would I want from that? And I honestly don't know. I'm very torn. But what I would love is more space to have really honest conversations about what people need. And I don't think it's possible because things have become so inflamed and so politicized, and there are so many hurt feelings. And I think the museum and archives, you know, institutions need to actually acknowledge the ways in which they have caused incredible harm, you know, the horrors that they have perpetrated, right? So how do we actually kind of move on from that in real transparency and with a sense of wanting to do repair in good faith?
That is such a big question. The notion of acknowledgement of harm, and then the accountability of that harm. It seems to me from conversations that we have had that You've both mentioned that the work of archives and the works of archivists and collection specialists and conservators is central to that process of acknowledgement and accountability. So Dominique, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how the archive where you are is central to that process and to the building of a relationship with the community that you serve.
And I think for me, like I've said before, the golden line for me has always been that it's the community that I serve and have the privilege of serving in its temporal space. There will be, the community could easily choose another representative at any point. And I don't know if institutions always think about information as a source of access and privilege and power, because it is, and access to that, not just the information itself, but access to that information, as Sanchita was saying, is a source of privilege and power. And when you're positioning the community in the center of that, when you're positioning the community as the source of that power, the bridge isn't a bridge. I kind of want to do away with these ideas of like bridges and tables, and I know we've been down this path, but I kind of want to think of it more of a ecosystem, of a ecological system, honestly, of a natural system in which we all kind of grow and move and breathe together and can grow and flourish and thrive together. And I have my role, and the trees have their role, and then the flowers have their role, and the water has its role, and everything kind of breathes and is. And I know it's not necessarily the most technical archival way of thinking, but that's kind of how I genuinely think about information. Literally in terms of its ones and zeros, but how institutions and people and communities and languages and text and visual imagery, all of it grows and moves together. And as long as community is the goal, and information and sharing and access and openness is the goal, I don't typically find that we have bridges, we have rivers.
Gosh, that's gorgeous. I am mindful that we're nearing the top of the hour, so I want to give you both an opportunity to bring anything to the table that we may not have touched upon quite yet. So Sanchita, I'll have you go first.
Oh gosh. I wish we had, well, we'll have to have another call at some point and just sort everything out. I mean, I think, just to follow up maybe on what Dominique was saying, I mean, the importance of being in conversation with communities who demand things of you, and to be aware of who you're really in service to. I mean, to me, it seems like I'm in service to, and this is going to sound awfully vague, but really kind of beings past, present, and future, right? I mean, and as you said, that involves the waterways and the trees and the students and all of these ancient people. I mean, perhaps it sounds completely out there, but to me, that kind of drives the way that I think about how we should strive to work. And doing that means acknowledging at every stage that you're going to try things and you're going to get them wrong. And that the real hard work is to say, I got it wrong. I'm going to try and do it again in a different way. And you tell me if this is better. So I think what I hope is that we have the courage to do that kind of work over and over again and refuse to sort of get comfortable with this idea that we've got it all taken care of, we're doing it right. I really hope we have the courage to say, we're just going to keep trying, even though we know it's not right, but because we're trying to, repair this very fragile ecosystem.
And I'll say in conclusion, in response to that, because I agree, I also think sometimes that I'm a little thinking too far out there, but I remember this quote that goes something to the lines of, if you're trying to solve a problem that could be solved in your lifetime, maybe you're thinking too small. And that's kind of how I feel about these ecosystems, especially with the Teenie Harris collection, because there's so many stories. There's so many people and negatives and prints, and one print might have one person and another negative might have a small school group in it of 45 people, and every single one of their stories matters, and every single one of those stories deserves to be told. And maybe we reiterate and redo and retry and try again and ask for more clarity and ask if we did better this time and ask if we did better next time, and stay constantly in conversation with the communities, plural, the communities that we serve, to make sure that we are just getting closer and closer to stewardship, true stewardship. And I think that's kind of my last bit to add. It's not going to get solved in my lifetime, and I'm okay with that, but I'm willing to do my part.
I think that's a beautiful thought of knowing that, you know, things that you also are passing, you know, through time, right? Just like the object, well, just like everyone else. So at this point, I just want to wrap up. I want to thank again, Sylvia and I are so grateful to both Sanchita and Dominique for your presentations and for your generous answering of my questions and the questions of the audience. Thank you to the audience for being generous and being patient with us and with our first event. I also want to let everyone know that our next event of the series is on Thursday, March 18th at the same time. And it's actually a perfect continuation of this conversation. It's about communities, changing collections, and transforming communities. And the speakers will be Gamien Guillot of the Baltimore Museum of Art and Dana Bishop-Root, the Director of Education of the CMOA. So you can sign up through Eventbrite, and we've put that in the chat. We hope that you'll be staying on top of our future events through our Instagram and our Facebook. And finally, you know, thank you. I would like that to be our last, phrase of the evening. Thank you to Sanchita, thank you to Dominique, and thank you for sharing your time with the University Art Gallery today. Hope to see you next time.